Oh, maybe they got started.
Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started on our work session today. Thank you to everyone that is here. We do have a number of people that are attending virtually, so before we get started, I need to call for a vote on this. Ms. Keys-Gamara, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, and Ms. Cohen have submitted remote participation request forms due to medical conflicts. I will call for a vote from in-person members. All those in favor of approving Ms. Keys-Gamara, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, and Ms. Cohen's virtual request, please say aye. Raise your hand. Aye. Aye. Okay, and that is everyone in attendance. Thank you. Okay, so today we are here as part of our annual process to take a look at our capital improvement program and have a update on our membership report. And just for board information, you probably saw the email I sent. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, a little bit late yesterday. But we are not expecting any board decisions today. This is an informational meeting for you so that we can be prepared for voting on these documents or voting on the capital improvement program at a later date. Thank you very much. Thank you to staff for being here. Let's go ahead with the presentation.
No, thank you very much, Ms. Tolan and Ms. Corbett-Sanders. I just want to take a minute and thank Dr. Brabrand for his support, and especially each and every one of you for the 2x2s, for the feedback, the information that you've given us back, and certainly Mr. Smith. His support, both directly and indirectly, professionally and personally, I cannot thank him enough for the support he's given my department and the many different departments that we have. And we are all here for such a short period of time, and yet it is our time to be here making a difference on behalf of our students. And I just want to personally thank Mr. Smith for, under Dr. Brabrand's leadership and supervision, also Dr. Ivy, all the support that they've given. And I just can't thank you enough, Marty, for all of that. And with that, I'd like to also acknowledge Ms. Lidi Haruda, who is here, who is another outstanding member of the cool team, as we call them, the Chief Operations Leadership, and also Brian Schuster, who's here with us as well from the Planning Department. I'd like to thank him and Pranita Rambize, and also Jessica Gillis for all of the work that they do. They make me look good. They do amazing work, each and every one of them. So anyway, with that, I just want to go ahead and get started with a brief presentation on the updates to the CIP. Now, the first slide that we're going to talk about really speaks to the time frame. On November 9th, 2021, we presented the membership trends report at the school board work session, and on December 6th, The Fairfax County Department of Planning and Development presented a review of major planning and development activities to the Comprehensive Planning Development Committee. On December 16th, we presented the proposed CIP as new business, and a public hearing.
Mr. Plattenberg?
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry to interrupt you, but unfortunately, our 3 virtual people can't hear right now, so maybe we should pause for a minute. No, I think it's
Yeah.
a little more than that.
It was that what here, but not.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I don't know what I can talk about, but it's one of the most absolutely precious young babies I have seen. Having children myself, the miracle of birth is one of the greatest gifts to be a part of. And when you see a child, the intake their first breath of oxygen and that color change of the blood in their system, and I call it 5-year iterations because, as I mentioned about we're here for a short time, as many of you know, when you have a child that's born, that miracle, they first roll over or on their knees, when they stand, then when they walk. Their reliance on you to hold your hand walking across the street, learning to ride a tricycle or a bike, and then growing up through the middle school years, and then into high school. You want them to be independent, you want them to grow, and yet you're seeing yourself as a young child thrown back at you, and all the challenges and joys that presents. And then the struggle with releasing them and letting them go off to post-secondary education or work, and then watching them become independent citizens. It's one of the greatest gifts, and I'm just so grateful for Ms. Gillis and happy for her and Jeffrey, her husband, just to have this beautiful joy that just, you know, thank goodness there's another student coming to Fairfax County Public School.
There you go. So, Mr. Plattenberg, as a parent, I wanted to listen to that whole thing. But we're all fine technically now, so we can go ahead with the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. And on the first slide, as I said, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to a little scat there a little bit. But on the first slide, I just was going through the dates and really to show that we've had a number of input sessions, number of opportunities, and we'll continue to have the opportunity for community feedback and, of course, school board feedback for the CIP. The next slide speaks to what the CIP is. It's a planning and fiscal management tool that really is used to coordinate the location, timing, and funding of projects over a 5-year period. You know, it includes the annual review of student membership and facilities data to identify projects such as new construction, capacity enhancements, modular additions, renovations, and it's on the next slide actually, and really speaks to a number of the different things that we have going on. Slide number 4 that we're talking about really speaks about what the pandemic has done for us. Right there, thanks. Yep. I'll go ahead and advance it then. But it really talks about the impact of the pandemic. And what we've done is it's impacted our overall membership. You know, as I mentioned before, we had a decline in membership of 8,859 or 5% of the students from school year 2019 to 2020. And 2020 to 2021 continued the downward trend with a decrease of 1,556. It's a contracted decrease, but it's still a decrease. And we think that the tail end of this pandemic and the impact of it, whatever the new normalcy is, with the different variants from Delta to Omicron to whatever the next may be, will continue to become part of our daily lives. And I think the normalcy the new normalcy, whatever that is, as I stated, will continue to evolve and develop. But I'm just basically going over what the primary factors are, what the CIP is for those who may have missed those previous work sessions. But the primary factors are presented to aid in the evaluation of the change in total membership. It includes our birth to kindergarten ratio that we speak about all the time, which is back up, but it's still low in comparison. Our migration of students and the transfer of students. Additional factors that are looked at is our cohort progression of an increase or decrease in membership, changes in county population, new residential development, housing turnover, and any program or boundary changes. The next slide talks about the 5-year projection set that we really take a look at. And let me see if I can get to that. And really, it's what I've presented before about the capital improvement program. As I said, it was presented as new business on December 6, 2021. And so based upon feedback from the school board, the presentation has been updated to include actual student membership for school years 2019-2020 and 2020-21, along with school year 21-22, to provide a reference point. Now, this was a request by almost to a one, every single school board member, to make sure that we provide a contextual relationship of this CIP. It can be found on slide 9 of the updated presentation as well. The presentation also includes brief description of the CIP capital projects on the CIP schedule on slide 12, and estimated schedule of funding projects within the 5-year time frame. And the information can also be found on pages 40 to 41 of the proposed CIP. We've already made those adjustments. The CIP presents information on implementation and recommendation from several of the school board committees as well, and other joint initiatives. One such initiative is the Joint Board of Supervisors School Board Capital Improvement Program Committee, which is a working group to discuss the CIP and allow for better information sharing, prioritizations, and planning by both the county and FCPS. The committee published their recommendations in October 2021, which included increasing the general obligation bond sale limit annually, dedicate the equivalent value of 1 penny to the real estate tax to the capital improvement program, and increase the percentage allocated to the capital sinking fund at year end and include schools in the allocation. The annual limit for the general obligation bond funding has increased over time from $130 million in 2011 to $155 million in 2012 and $180 million since 2019. And that's an annual appropriation, a debt ceiling cap allowed by the Board of Supervisors for our bond voter-passed bond referendum program. The funding has remained insufficient to renovate the schools in the current renovation queue, and as all of you know, we've had an average 37-year school age before it got renovated. But through the Joint Board of Supervisors, School Board CIP Committee initiatives, the CIP project schedule assumes the continuation of the annual limit of $180 million general obligation bond funding, with an increase of $25 million in FY23 and FY24, followed by an increase of $50 million beginning in the FY25, for a total of $230 million annually in future years. That is nothing short of huge. That is a massive investment. By working together, we've shown that the Board of Supervisors and the school board, collaboratively working on how to improve and provide our needs, have shown their ability to do so. And the next slide talks about the Joint Environmental Task Force. The JET was established in April of 2019 as a result of the joint environmental collaboration between both the school board and the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, following a joint environmental policy meeting between the two boards in 2019. The JET's mission is to join the political and administrative capabilities of the county and the school system to proactively address climate change and environmental sustainability. Since its inception, the JET has organized subcommittees around 4 specific areas: transportation, workforce development, energy, waste management, and recycling. In October 2020, the JET issued a final report with recommendations for each of the 4 subcommittees, and the following slides are going to brief update on what the status of the JET goals are. This month, staff will provide the JET executive team a short written summary of the contract negotiation results and next steps to achieve the full implementation of our solar plan, which is a massive undertaking, but one that is definitely overdue. A final meeting of the JET committee to include citizen members will be convened in mid-January to provide a full update to the committee. Updates on the other JET goal areas, workforce waste reduction, and transportation will also be provided at that time. Quarterly collaborative reviews of the progress toward JET goals are going to be conducted with the county and the school division staff and the Board of Supervisors and school board representatives, who will then have the ability to provide updates to each of the individual boards. I mention that because that's a significant part of where we are headed collectively. The current status of the transportation goals, we've placed into operation 8 electric school buses in May 2021. Electric, or what we call EV buses, are assigned to Region 5 schools currently, and it's for logistical reasons that they're currently provided for that. because there is a demand to provide them across the district. We've had requests from the Mount Vernon representatives and others to have them represented in their parts of the region. EV bus performance has been parallel to that of the diesel engine buses currently. There have been no operational interruptions, which is very good for something that's that new. Maintenance to the EV buses has not been any concern, and those are the things that we're watching to see how we can go ahead and deploy and expand this initiative. We submitted a DEER grant application to provide 4 electric buses and 2 diesel buses, and awards are going to be announced in July of this year. The federal infrastructure bill will also include $5 billion in funding to support zero and low emission school buses over the next 5 years at up to 100% of the bus and infrastructure costs. And I say that to say that everybody is getting on board, no pun intended. So the current status of the zero waste goals are we've been collaborating through zero waste teams which developed a plan, and they're now starting to shift focus to implementation. What that means is the zero waste team has submitted a request for an EIP funding that will potentially jumpstart some of the small initiatives, and some of the funding could be allocated to us for similar projects. Potential uses of these funds are for us to have reusable packaging supplier grant, interns similar to the green intern funded in 2021-22, funding for potentially more expensive but more sustainable packaging vendors, bottle filling, water stations expansion, hand dryers, zero waste stations, composting bins, and other consultants to help with our zero waste program and staffing initiatives. Funding needs for sustainability and coordinators across the school district are also going to be identified, and the grounds management is conducting a pilot battery-powered lawn equipment at 12 schools through the winter of this year and into the spring of 2022. And the last two, the current status of the workforce development goals are exploring the workforce development internship opportunities in skilled trades areas. We have a real need for that. This board has been continuously supportive of it during our budget process. Planning career pathways, speaker series, and career webinars in collaboration with the Department of Public Works, Environmental Services, and the ISD Science Team. Fairfax Water to host summer student intern opportunities, and also investigating the Falls Church City Public Schools pathway of courses for an academy for sustainable thinking. And also developing renewable and sustainable energy lessons to be integrated in the existing STEM engineering course. The JET energy recommendations 2, 3, and 4 were discussed. Recommendation 2 is to achieve 50% reduction by 2030 from a 2019 baseline. Now, it's important to note that we in the FCPS have achieved a 26.5% greenhouse gas emissions reduction since 2019. Now, last year's executive stay-at-home order due to the coronavirus pandemic may have disproportionately contributed to the energy savings, but we had a successful program even prior to that. Recommendation number 3 is to increase renewable energy across the county and school properties. The solar vendors have been requested cost adjustments under their contract for solar PPAs. A subset of the original selection advisory committee has reconvened to review these vendor proposals for cost adjustments. And the schools and county staff agree on the need for flexible solar purchasing through PPA, ESPCs, CIP, et cetera, to remove any concept of exclusivity to the solar PPA vendors. School staff plans to include canopy solar projects. You'll be receiving a Brayburn brief soon that speaks to that and shows some graphic pictorials of our intention to include canopy solar projects in future assessments under circumstances where roofs may not be viable. And this is something that I've been pressing in our conversations with the county members, that I think we all have to expand what we're talking about with solar, not just what was initiatives that the 2 school board and board of supervisors have agreed to. But I think in order to meet our 50% goals, we're going to need to expand to canopies. And I've said ground-based solar canopies and opportunities like that, because the county has a land mass that's rather large, and we do in terms of parking lots. I think that's an opportunity that we're going to all need to take advantage of. Supervisor Stork, and along with School Board Member Karen Corbett Sanders, has requested that the DPMM SAC engage with the vendors to understand their capacity needs from school and county properties. The SAC later confirmed that this threshold has been addressed under the vendor's new pricing proposal because the proposed contract rates are contingent on those projects. And recommendation number 4 is to decrease the total energy use across the county. Schools, as I mentioned, 25% by 2030, 50% by 2040, and utilizing a 2019 baseline. And when I say that we've achieved 22.7 since 2019, which is the JET goal, it's important to note that we didn't just start then. We are 33.7 energy reduced since 2014. We have a pre-existing energy commitment from this board and the U.S. Department of Energy to achieve 25% reduction by 2030 and 50% by 2014 from our 2014 baseline. I mention these things only because they are part and parcel of our CRP conversation, and absolutely imperative that our community understands our commitment to solar, but also that we've been doing many things that impact our CIP and our capital facilities. And the next portion, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Lidi Haruta for her presentation. She has been outstanding in the board's request for looking for analysis, recognition that this is a first foray into these waters. We're dipping our toes in rather than diving in head first because we don't know where the bottom is. And because of the research that she's initiated, and she and her team have begun, that shows that there's a breadth of information, but some that is inconclusive. I won't steal her thunder, but I say that so we give grace to the work that they've done and recognition of the efforts that they've undergone on behalf of the school board's request. So with that, Lidi.
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. And I'm happy to be here this morning to share the highlights of the analysis of FCPS membership report that has been produced by my office. The report itself was originally shared when Mr. Plattenberg presented the CIP in December, and the report in today's presentation covers some of the data that were included in the facilities presentation on membership trends back in November. We have also conducted additional analyses to help with the findings and the conclusions that are drawn. Before I start in on the presentation itself, I'd also like to take the time to thank Michelle Farrar and Janine Lucina from my office, who led the efforts to create this report, as well as facility staff, my two colleagues here, as well as Jessica Gillis and Pranita Ranbizi. How did you get it to work? Not working? I don't know. Apologies about this. Can you move it forward? Thank you. Still not working? Marty, can you try? If you guys can just do it, I'll let you know. Okay. If you can move on to the next slide. Still not moving. Can you go back one? No? Oh, it's working now? Thank you, Marty. Marty fixed it. Okay. All right, so sorry for that intermission. I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about the report's purpose. Mr. Plattenberg alluded to the fact that this is a first report, and so we tried to make sure that we were getting kind of a broad overview of the last 5 years of data, so going back to school year 2017-18, all the way through to the fall of the current school year. And the report covers the 3 questions that are listed here on this slide, which we'll be returning to as we go through the data slides. this is also a foundational piece, as Mr. Plattenberg said. It doesn't answer all the questions that I know you have and the community has around membership trends, but it begins to answer the questions that are related to the factors that are influencing membership, as well as capacity and programming. So on the right, you'll see the 3 different types of membership that the report covered, which was overall division membership, migration, and transfer. So we'll be looking at a number of charts today that answer the study questions, so a bit of an orientation on how the slides are set up before we kind of dig into the data itself. The questions at the top indicate what's being answered. That's followed by a statement in the blue of the finding that's associated with that question that's shown on this slide. And then the graphic shows the data that's framed in the statement. And then in the bottom left, you will also see that there are page numbers that refer back to the report itself in case you want to see more detail about what's being discussed in the slide. Now, the question shown on this graphic is about the overall stability of membership over the last few years. And you will see that it's been relatively flat, which indicates that prior to the pandemic, we had relatively stable membership at about slightly below 190,000. Then in the red circle, you'll see that after the pandemic began and as we started this last school year, FCPS experienced that 10,000 student decrease in membership that everyone's aware of. And this decreased membership just to below 180,000, where we've remained since last September. Taking a look at how we compare in terms of our membership trends to Virginia and other national school divisions, you'll see on the left and on the right that the blue triangle represents FCPS membership in terms of changes. If you're above the 100, you have increases in membership. Below 100, you'd be having decreases. And you can see that our membership is in the range of what we found for other school divisions in Virginia as well as the rest of the country. Since COVID, those changes have trended where we're in the lower part of what's considered relatively normal for those 2 different groupings, but we still remain relatively equivalent to other school divisions. Moving on to migration, this slide helps us understand migration in and out of the school division. And there's a lot to say about the information that's on this slide, so I'm going to go through this one in particular in a lot of detail. At the top, you see the same overall FCPS membership trend line that we looked at before, showing division membership and then drop to 180,000 about a year ago. And below that, you see columns that represent migration in and out throughout the year. Migration out is represented by the yellow columns, and migration in is represented by the teal or the blue columns. The graph leaves out the normal ebb and flow of students coming in for kindergarten and graduating at the end of 12th grade so that we can focus on the migration patterns in the other grades. And we'll get to those 2 grade levels, the kindergartners and the grade 12 students, in a little while. So continual migration in and out occurs throughout the school year, and here we've shown it for 3 different time periods. In each year, we have September, or the beginning of the year, January, mid-year, and then May for the end of year numbers. And you can see that FCPS's typical pattern of migration in and out is slightly less migration out, or a shorter yellow column at most of those time points, than migration in, so a taller blue column at most of those time points. And migration is happening throughout the year, but most of it occurs between the end of one school year and the beginning of the next, so it shows up in this chart under September of each year. And we're going to be focusing the look at the data in this chart on September numbers in particular. So focusing on what's in the red circle, you can see that the typical pattern for the last several years flipped last September, and migration out was shown by the taller yellow column, then migration in. And that contributed to the overall membership decrease at the beginning of last year. But you can also see that migration in, or the blue columns, is shorter in September 2020 than in the other Septembers prior to the pandemic. And that means fewer students arrived to join us at the start of last school year than at the start of the prior years. And altogether, counting the students that are shown here, as well as those in kindergarten that I'll talk about shortly, there was an overall, FCPS saw overall 6,000 fewer students come into the school division than in a typical year. And this means that the majority of the 10,000 student decrease in FCPS was because students did not migrate in as expected, as opposed to the 4,000 students who migrated out, the 4,000 more students who migrated out than in a typical year. Also, you see in this graphic that the last set of yellow and teal columns from September of 2021, so the beginning of this school year, show a return to greater migration in than greater than out. So we have the taller blue column than the yellow column, and that's the more typical pattern that we had seen prior to the pandemic. Also, you can see that migration in was higher this school year, so the blue column is higher than seen previously, even though migration out remained relatively high this school year compared to pre-pandemic levels. Now, here's the same data we looked at on the prior slide. It's presented in a different way, adding the migration in and out together to get net migration. And it shows that by last spring, FCPS had returned to the typical migration patterns that reflect increasing membership in grades 1 to 11. And again, we'll discuss the kindergarten and the grade 12 separately in a few slides. So in terms of migration in, we don't really know the reasons why students didn't show up. So we don't really have reasons around that, but we do have reasons that families provide to us as they migrate out. And in this chart, you see those reasons documented. There's 3 years of data represented on this slide, 2 full years, as well as the summer leading into this school year. And the tallest columns are those all the way on the left, and those are associated with moving out of Fairfax to attend public schools elsewhere in Virginia or the United States. And that means families are no longer eligible to attend FCPS because they're no longer county residents. The height of the columns in the graphic represent the number of students rather than the percentages that are listed, because the student count is what impacts FCPS's overall membership. And the percentages that are added to the information on the slide represent the proportion of migration out within the time frame listed. For example, for summer 2021, the green bars show that 7,283 students exited FCPS over the summer, and that represented 65% of the students migrating out over the summer. Now taking a look at the remaining reasons provided by families when migrating out, you see a large increase in the number and percentage of students who left FCPS last year to either homeschool or attend a private school in Fairfax County. More specifically, the numbers increased considerably in terms of both the number and percent who were leaving because of decisions to homeschool their students or to attend a private school. These are students that could return to FCPS, assuming they still remain in the county. We'll need to see whether at the end of this school year, which is the green bar at the moment that only covered the summer, when we have more than just the summer data on migration out, whether the seeming return to lower levels of transferring out for these 2 reasons remains. Our next slide takes a look at whether any of the students had returned once they migrated out last year. What you see here is that at least 1,000 more students, we had 2,323 students return in school year 21-22, returned this year than in the prior 2 years when the number returning was closer to 1,000. This likely represents migration back to FCPS of students who had left to homeschool or attend private school in Fairfax County. As described in the report, we had conducted some analyses in my office last year that showed that our white students and our non-English learners and non-students with disabilities were likely to have left for those 2 reasons in particular. And this matches the demographics that are shown on this slide in terms of those who have returned. You see greater proportions of returning students were white, 60% compared to 30% previously, as well as smaller proportions of students who were non-English learners or not students with disabilities than seen in prior years. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back to the issue of kindergarten and grade 12. This is one of the factors that has affected why membership has declined. Exiting grade 12 cohorts, the blue line that's depicted in this graphic, has been consistently larger than the incoming kindergarten cohort, or the yellow line. This has been true over the last several years and is projected to continue to be larger moving forward for the next several years. This means that as we move from year to year, the kindergarten cohort is not replacing our grade 12 graduates, yielding a net loss in membership every year. This downward pressure on membership will continue to exist for at least the next several years as the birth rate of our upcoming kindergarten cohorts continues a decreasing trend. Prior to the pandemic, the higher migration in each year made up for this difference. However, the very small kindergarten cohort last year, it was under 11,000, contributed a net decrease of approximately 2,000 more students on top of the 4,000 net decrease that was found in the other grades. And unless migration in the other grades makes up the size difference between kindergarten and grade 12, FCPS will continue to see decreasing membership. A final factor that we looked at was pyramids and whether pyramids differ in whether they had migration in or migration out. This slide shows the level of net migration within a pyramid across all the schools in that pyramid. Green indicates a net gain in membership in that pyramid, and red indicates a net loss. Last year, a similar map showed that all pyramids were red, and that's included in the report, and that meant that there were decreases across all pyramids in the division. So the membership decrease that we had seen overall in the division was actually experienced within every pyramid as well. Now this year, there's a mixture of gains and losses. The largest net decrease in migration this year is seen in the Westfield pyramid. It's negative 3.8% decline in membership in that pyramid, while the largest net increase is in the Langley pyramid, where we saw a 3% increase. Now, the changes in these two pyramids were driven by membership changes at elementary schools, not at the middle or high school levels. So that's a lot of different info about migration. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to sum up the big points around it. Firstly, the large decrease in FCPS membership at the start of the COVID pandemic primarily stemmed from students not arriving or not migrating in, the 6,000 students. And we don't really know why. We don't have information on the students who didn't come into the school division, and so it's not really known why those students didn't arrive. Additionally, given the recent instability in the FCPS membership, it is difficult to base facilities decisions on the available data. Until the trends stabilize and we can count on understanding what the projections should be moving forward, it's very hard to make facilities decisions based on the membership trend data itself, and that was something that Mr. Plattenberg alluded to. Thirdly, a return to the strong in-migration that we see this year is certainly helpful and a positive sign for future membership numbers increasing. But even if that trend continues, it will not fully offset net decreases expected as larger cohorts of graduates exit and smaller cohorts of kindergartners enter, meaning it's likely that membership will continue to decline over the next several years. And then lastly, FCPS should continue to examine membership data so the division can not only track when migration in and out stabilizes, but also develop a deeper understanding of the trends in membership and the many factors that influence them. I'm now going to go ahead and switch us over to transfers and talk a little bit about transfers in and out. Transfers don't typically impact the membership numbers in the school division. FCPS has a regulation, though, that allows students to move from school to school, and so membership within a specific school may be impacted by transfers. Some of the reasons that students are allowed to transfer are programmatic in nature, things like being assigned to a school that has a Fcps site, attending an AAP center, language immersion, or participating in either the AP or the IB program if it is not offered at your base school. And some of the reasons you're allowed to transfer are not programmatic in nature, things like siblings attending schools when students are younger, or FCPS employee parents working at schools or nearby schools when students are younger. You'll see that the transfers have been mostly stable over time over the last 5 years. Both before and after the pandemic, there hasn't been all that much change. Annually, transfers in and out are largely equivalent, and the major differences of approximately 500 each year is migration into TJ of non-Fairfax County residents that have been admitted to the schools and are counted as transfers into the school division. We took a deeper dive into some of those programs that I had mentioned to see whether any of them were related to what you could do to predict transfers in or out of schools. And the major finding on that was that at the elementary and middle school levels, the presence or absence of an AAP center or a language immersion program explained the majority of transfers in the school division. And this was a stable finding across both pre-COVID and post-COVID years. So in concluding about transfers, FCPS controls the regulation that allows for student transfers to and from school sites for programmatic reasons. When addressing issues of overcrowding or underutilized facilities at the elementary and middle school level, the division may also want to consider transfers and how that might impact it, and in particular, the placement of AAP center or immersion programming at schools. And I just want to make very clear that this does not mean removal of programs, but rather consideration of the amount of schools feeding the program and potentially adding the program to a nearby site that allows less feeding into the school that might be overcrowded. And with that, I wanted to just end by saying ORC is going to continue to support departments about the membership analysis and any kind of interpretation related to the programming and capacity as needed, given that this was a foundational piece. I turn it back over to school board discussion.
Okay. We can open up for school board questions and discussion. I think we had first on our list Mr. Frisch, who I think it looks like he has stepped out. So Dr. Anderson, you are next up, and followed by Ms. Amish.
Thank you. Not 100% ready. I want to go ahead and start with the last point that you just made. Liddy, thank you again for this information. When you were talking about being a little bit more strategic about the AAP centers, I know in my community this is quite a concern because we do have pyramids that do not have an AAP center. And by the time we get to the middle school level, frankly, it's a little bit of it's a huge challenge for many of our parents. And I know that this board talked about the middle school AAP center, which was a forum topic that I presented with, is it with you? I don't remember, with, thank you, with Ms. Corbett-Sanders last year, and I think we're still waiting to hear what is to come from staff about that. But given what you've just shared, I would love to hear a little bit more detailed recommendations regarding what you are perceiving is your thinking, as you've outlined on this page, that we should be thinking about having an AAP center. You said in places that would reduce kind of the crowding and the bottlenecking in certain schools. Can you give a little, I don't want to put words in your mouth, can you give us a little bit more details in terms of your recommendation? I'll start there.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I think as we were looking at it in light of membership issues at schools. And so the thinking around it is really, if there's a situation where there's overcrowding at a school, and that situation is partly attributable to transfers in, which Mr. Plattenberg's department knows when it's attributable to transfers in based on data that they have, that in those kinds of situations, it would be a good idea to take a look at whether AAP programming is available elsewhere that could decrease the need for having as many schools feed into that school, so that there could be either schools that feed into that particular school that feed elsewhere, or potentially the need to place an additional program, as you're alluding to. We don't have specific, we didn't dig into it enough to have specific recommendations on it should happen here or shouldn't. It was a much more global kind of recommendation about including a look at those things in those specific situations where there's overcrowding that can be attributable to too many students transferring in.
I would like to ask some more specific support to Sloan Presidio's shop as they're working on the response to that forum topic. Because specifically, I'm thinking in my community, we have Glasgow, which is the only middle school AAP center for all of the 3 pyramids in Mason District. It has 1,900 students at this middle school. And the fact that it is absorbing students from from the Justice Pyramid, the Annandale Pyramid, as well as the Falls Church Pyramid, really makes it a little bit of an issue. So I would like to have some of your recommendations be folded into what Dr. Presidio will be providing to us when we are having that middle school recommendation. Thank you. Another question that I wanted to ask, so sorry to be so dense on this. I've been looking at this for a while, and I don't think I have full clarity on what you mean. If we can go back to slide 9 in the analysis piece. Can you repeat again what you just shared? Because there was something that didn't really land for me about this slide.
I believe slide 9 is the kindergartner and grade 12 cohort. Yes. So that slide depicts the difference between the size of our graduating 12th grade cohort, which is that upper line in blue, and the size of our incoming kindergarten cohort, which is the line in yellow. So typically, if our sizes of those 2 grades, as grade 12 graduates and leaves, and we have a similarly sized group of kindergartners coming in the fall, we won't experience membership changes. It'll be pretty equivalent. What we see here is that our kindergarten cohorts have consistently been considerably smaller, and in particular last year were much smaller than this graduating grade 12 cohort. And so that basically is a net decrease. And unless we have more students come in through grading into other grade levels, we will see continuing declines in membership just based on that alone.
And this speaks pretty much to the birth ratio.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it is a national trend. It's not just a Fairfax County trend.
Okay. So my question is, how do we also incorporate the other reasons why we may have some increase in populations in Fairfax County? Migration, even the Afghan refugees that have been here really have saturated some areas of Fairfax County. We have an elementary school that has had now around 50 students enter. How do you account for other types of migration which could impact the population?
So the report covers that in the other migration pieces. The report actually includes 2 sets of charts. It includes migration in and out, including kindergarten and grade 12, and it includes migration in and out solely looking at the non-kindergarten grade 12 issue. So it tries to separate those 2 things. What I presented here today was just the non-kindergarten grade 12 migration in and out, but it's captured in that piece of it, and it has not been specifically sorted out. That would be the kind of thing that a future report, if the school board wanted to take a deeper dive look at migration in and out, could be looked at. This is just kind of the lay of the land at a kind of a higher level, but those pieces are included in those counts. They're just not disaggregated in ways that you can clearly see that because we didn't take a deep dive into that particular part of it.
Can you just
page
share what the
26.
trend is that you're seeing with that migration?
The trend is the same as the trend that I had shown for just the grades 1 to 11. So the migration had been, migration in had been greater, and then more recently, last year, it suddenly decreased. We didn't have as many students coming in, but we have now returned to greater migration in.
And page 26 in your CIP speaks a little bit more to that.
A little
birth
clearer,
figure.
Jeff.
Page 26 of your CIP talks a little more about that birth ratio, and then we also have a segment on migration as well. But it doesn't get to the level that you're looking at. For those, what we look at when we see like the term refugees, I don't believe is the one that we use, but when we look at influx of something that may occur either internationally, nationally, or so forth, we've had changes in the past where we've had those impacts. And there is an opportunity, as you say, to delve deeper into the overall impacts on those. Once they become pretty stable, because sometimes they're transitional in terms of where initial placement is and then future broadening out of that impact. We've had that before with unintended minors. We've had it before with other initiatives. We've had impacts of things like we thought when Amazon, HQ2, that whole initiative and conversation, we believed that that was going to have a greater impact. So we had all of these forecasts, and we talk about developments in areas like Tyson's and the Mount Vernon, Route 1 area and so forth. And, but then the pandemic hit. So that's why when we say we're looking to see how to stabilize the trend analysis or get some stability in that market space, if you will, of enrollment and data, to look at what those impacts are so we can actually give a more responsive and appropriate answer. I don't know. I think we do need to develop some models or forecasts to be looking at and develop some criteria in that area, much like we've done our student yields based upon development and further detail analysis on that. But I don't know, I don't want to speak for Ms. Haruta, but we have had different impacts over time, and we do update them each year in the CIP. But to your point about being proactive, forecasting, so we can put the supports in place
Right.
for those schools that are impacted.
Because it's so significant, and I know I've run out of time, so thank you.
When you stepped out, we called on Dr. Anderson and then Ms. Amash. Do you mind? Oh,
No, he should go ahead.
okay. Mr. First, but before you start, I just want to remind all board members that the next step document link was sent to you this morning. So please pull that up and add any next steps you have to that document. Mr. Frisch, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work that's been done on this document. I know it's been an interesting 2 years, to say the least. When we did our last CIP in the normal process pre-COVID, the board unanimously passed a motion to begin, now granted this is pre-COVID, to begin the requeuing process for renovations or major renovation projects for different schools. I think that's of particular interest to folks who represent schools like you just mentioned, Route 1, Chantilly, Oakton, the Tyson's Periphery. Previously, in that CIP, we had, or in the previous CIP, we had planned on having that requeuing done in 2023, and the motion was passed to make it happen in 2022. Is that going to be possible this year?
No.
Okay. Do you want to give me more detail?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to. So when we looked at that, right, we looked at what the impact would be, and then we also recognized the work that's been done with the boundary policy and how that may impact or not impact. The conversations with everything that we've had going on and prioritizing the work, that is something that we know is important. Now the current queue expires with the beginning of construction on the last phase of the queue in 2027. So when we look at that, acknowledging what the board had said about, well, it's important for us to get started now so that we're prepared at that time. The work associated with that, when we've talked about, when we had our consultant come back and speak before this body on the MGT boundary consultant, speak about best practices and so forth. The thinking, the conversation, and I think there were questions that were asked at that time as well, Mr. Frisch, and possibly from you, because I know you've been inquiring about this for some time, is how we're going to go about that process, because the CIP speaks to how the last queue was developed it articulates clearly what the prioritization and the percent ratios were and how previous boards had rated what those elements would be. We felt that that report would inform the work associated with it, and that's why the initial no comment, right? The belief was that that would inform how our next step or phase would be. And it's something where we've looked at whether or not we should bring an individual consultant, not that group, but some group like that, to help facilitate this process with this body as to the national best practices, also recognizing what the previous queuing process was, and then identifying what the criteria would be for that. Because some of the criteria that were for the last one was capacity, ability to meet curriculum being offered in the individual schools, and some of those things, depending on the programs that you had, if you had students that had needs that the facility didn't accommodate, that rated that school higher. Well, as we've been talking about, some programs shift. So when that rating was done, the shift that happened, other schools felt like they were slighted, that they weren't rated higher. So this body may feel, among other things, this body may feel that the queuing process needs to be based upon a certain set of criteria, and those criteria are going to need to be developed.
And I would also add that as we're now in this COVID space, I won't say post-COVID, because I think that we're going to have COVID with us for quite a long time. As we think about the stabilization and what our ed specs look like down the road, I think that that will also be part of our considerations as we think about a new queue down the road, and as we think about what our needs will be and what the education infrastructure will look like for schools down the road. It's very different than what we were looking at with our last queue, and I think that it would be very different than what we would be looking at down the road, even if we began that process today in terms of what our needs will be based on information that we've seen here for migration patterns, but also with the fact that that we may be using virtual tools more, and just may see space being used differently in the future. And that's all going to be major considerations for us as we think about the queue and what our building needs will be.
But that's pretty normal, right? Like knowing that when we embark on creating the queue, that over the length of the duration of the queue, things are going to change and evolve.
No,
That's why the queue, I'm sorry.
no, I would say that is normal. I was talking about that stabilization period as we are now trying to figure our way through COVID and figure out where we will be as we see this pandemic becoming part of our reality more so than getting to the other side. And as we see that stabilization, we can build all of those data points into what the queue and ed specs would look like.
And the queue did change.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to your point, right, it does evolve or can be changed. And when it was done, it was pretty intense, as it was when the original queue was created. So those processes, again, we were awaiting the MGT report. It was something we articulated because we felt the boundary policy would or could potentially impact where we would go with the queue. And because we had till the 2027 the renovation of the last portion of the queue, I felt that there was time appropriate. And to be quite honest, we were trying to prioritize all of our work during this pandemic because staff has been really just overwhelmed, overburdened, burnout, time and time again. I know this board's recognized over the year, but a lot of people are forgetting that now. From different venues and veins and starting to press on, well, where is this? Where is it? Why aren't we done this? It's like, well, if you take a look at what we've been doing.
Oh,
No,
this is
not
no slag
you,
on y'all.
not you,
and
not you,
I think
Mr.
that's-
Frisch.
I understand,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
think that's what this process is for.
Absolutely.
Right, is to check in on the things, because it's not just us that are asking, right? People ask us what's going on with different things. And to that end, I think one of the ways that we could take some of this burden off of the shoulders of your team, which is stretched thin, is to do what you just kind of mentioned, which is maybe work with a consultant to help guide the process and develop a way forward. That's something I'll be exploring with my colleagues in one-on-one conversations, because I think there's probably tremendous appetite for that. Because we don't want to delay it because we're also asking for a million other things from all of you. Speaking of delays, or not delays, but speaking of things that I would hopeful we could get moving more quickly. The Western High School kind of strikes a similar point here, right? It has the ability to relieve capacity in a number of overcrowded high schools. I look at Oakton High School in my district, for example, that's projected to be at over 125% capacity after the renovation is finished. How can we move the Western High School along? We approved money to buy the property in this last bond. How do we move forward?
That's a good question, and thank you for your statements about the other one as well, because I totally concur about looking for a way forward. In terms of the Western High School, there's been funding that's been identified for site acquisition in a couple bond referendums, actually. And in the conversation, that gives us a lot of latitude to go ahead and get that work underway. I'm going to be working with our planning team. The fact that we've had a contraction in our enrollment that you heard impacts that, but we have had some increases at certain high schools, and you mentioned. Fairfax High School as well was one that showed out in our previous conversations that has shown growth. So we're going to be working with our team to see exactly where we need to be in terms of moving forward on that individual project as well, and come back to the board to get that, because I've heard the same interest in getting us to move forward on that Western High School, and in fact many of your colleagues have contacted me in that same exact
When do you think we should expect an update on that?
I don't know. I'll get back to you on our next steps. Okay. Thank you.
And then I appreciate everything you said about JET and the need for canopies. I visited family in the last year and saw my old high school in Los Angeles with the parking lot, giant parking lot covered in canopies, providing solar power. So if they can do it, we can certainly do it here. And we have lots of parking spaces that could be covered. So thank you for thinking creatively about that and for addressing the JET goals. And thank you again for page 43 being updated. That shows the progress being made on 3 of the projects that we set as priorities last time around. So appreciate it.
Ms. Amash?
Thank you. I want to follow, Mr. Planberg, you started with some passionate gratitude for the whole team, so I want to express similarly a lot of gratitude, especially for, I think, some of the pieces in this CIP which were responsive to a number of community concerns. Namely, what I said last time, but I'll bring up again on page 241, in being very clear in identifying inclusive spaces in a variety of ways to be more accommodating of our families and of course, promote a caring culture. I did have just kind of 3 key points or questions. One is, I know in the past, and I bring this up every time, but what equity considerations are involved as we put together plans for renovations, the queue. I'm almost thinking that perhaps we actually need to set up a process where an equity analysis is done as a key component of the CIP process to make sure that, as an individual board member, obviously I can't go into every renovation plan and every thing in the same way that you guys do when you have staff that go out and scope and look at things over time. But I am, curious if that's something that, in your mind would be a step forward, as we evaluate these things. Ms. Ruda mentioned the piece on programs, AAP, language immersion. There seems to be a need to have some collaboration there, as Dr. Anderson pointed out, with instructional services perhaps, or how we plan programs, especially for that eastern side of the county that she, mentioned. So I'll pause there, and I think even as a board, we might want to consider just how we structure this process moving forward now that we have more understanding around some of these issues and what has, unintentionally but significantly led to disparate outcomes, I guess, across the county.
Yeah, what I can say is Dr. Nardis King has even chimed in about, even today, to both Dr. Ivey and myself, about something on that same level to make sure that when we look at facilities, and specifically this was playgrounds, looking at the equitable access, and as Mr. Smith was mentioning, that would definitely have to be built into the RFP, and I think Mr. Frisch's comments about looking at an alternative path, I think is an excellent recommendation, path forward for us, and I think annotating that it is inclusive of that specific component is critical. Yeah.
And I would just add that given this board's, the import that this board has placed on equity, that would go without saying that would be built into any conversations that we would have moving forward. And really, as we think about program placement, as we think about as I said earlier, as we think about our ed specs and all of those pieces, equity would certainly drive how we view that work moving down the road.
And perhaps as a step, you know, within the more formal process that this entails, the CIP process. Along those lines, can you just refresh my memory, when it came to the boundary policy presentation, we had a conversation about what the next steps would be around that. Can you just delineate from your understanding where we are on that? After the consultant presentation.
Yeah, I'd have to refer to the school board office on what their next steps may be, because I'd hate to just speculate, but I do believe the next steps were to ensure that that the components that the consultant presented, and that the three were pretty much capacity, proximity, equity, to use a different, that those were inclusive of entry boundary policy that the board may want to adopt moving forward. But I'll get a more formal one, and we'll provide that, and we can put in the next steps, just an update on what the next steps are.
Yeah, no, that's fine, because I was consulting, you know, colleagues, and it seems there may be a little bit of a lack of clarity on that, and I think that is a core piece maybe that we can elevate today and think about. You know, if we want to take a look at those three priorities as you outlined that the consultant emphasized, and perhaps reevaluate our process as a part of reconsidering that policy, right? So I'll leave that to the chair to discuss with staff perhaps, but I'd love to see us have some kind of recommendation and clear next step, something scheduled for us to discuss. My final point or set of questions was just about the membership piece. Thank you, Ms. Ruda, for the presentation. Actually, I found that it was one of my next steps to ask for that analysis, so I'm glad that as a board we came together a year later. I just wanted to suggest for the following one that perhaps, since we don't have concrete findings here, looking at years before 2019, 2020 as well, or at least just 1 year, just to give us a sense if it's representative of what pre-COVID was, since that was impacted. And the second is pre and post virtual, I think, are also time posts of what might inform our understanding, and that could be helpful information. And finally, when we do that pyramid analysis, perhaps taking a look at COVID concentrations too. I know we had hotspots, things like that, just to further help us come to conclusions around, or, you know, just preliminary understandings around what's going on. But thank you so much for that.
And we would be happy to do anything that the board asks us to do, and there's consensus around doing. Yep.
Thank you. Just a couple things very quickly. Just in research I did this week, I know there are no next steps from our boundary discussion that we had a couple weeks ago. So, Ms. Amish, I would recommend that you put a next step maybe in the document today regarding that follow-up. I think that we had a verbal, you know, to get follow-up from staff on that. In addition, I want to assure you that Dr. King is online today with this meeting, so that she is here also. And with that, I believe we have Ms. Cohen is next on our list.
Hi, thanks so much. I appreciate all this work. I know I will need to go back to Ms. Tolan, so if you don't mind putting me down. I have a few questions. One, just to piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Anderson had talked about with potential adding programs. You know, I look at Orange Hunt with German immersion that certainly overburdens that school. We've got 1,100 kids, I think, at least in a typical year there, which is way above best practices for the number of kids in an elementary school. So I guess my question is, if that's something that we're looking at, I would argue that those conversations need to start happening with our community now, with our principals now, to find if there's an appetite locally to add an additional program and move some kids around. So I guess I would like some conversation about what that might look like.
So Ms. Cohen, if you could just share that last part of your question again, and I do know that Dr. Presidio is on the call as well today.
I was just asking about like the immersion program at Orange Hunt, for example, that we know is a big piece in that school being well over capacity. When do those conversations begin about potentially adding a program somewhere locally?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Cohen, for that conversation. Each year, we in the planning office have created a workflow process where we meet with all of the different departments, DSS, ISD, planning, designing, construction, and so forth. And we talk about where our capacities are, where the push and pull is in terms of what you just described. Through those conversations, we sometimes identify where there may be a need for expansion. And I know that Ms. Klemenko, we've been working with her on one recently when we were talking about a similar situation in another immersion program for expansion. So I do know that, and perhaps Mr. Presidio can speak a little bit more to it from their perspective, but we do annually have these meetings where we go through and discuss program placement and so forth. We have not in that process gone to do what was, I think, recommended by Ms. Anderson before, where we took a look at a broader perspective on adding or changing multiple programs. But when they get to the level like you're describing, that's when we start having these conversations. So, Dr. Presidio, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. I think you covered the process that we use really well. Just a few things maybe that I would add and point out. With respect to elementary AAP, just a reminder that we're continuing to work on expanding our local level 4 AAP programs to all of our elementary schools. And we're on target to have that initiated really by the school year 23-24 to finish up with the initiation at our remaining elementary schools that don't have local level 4 programs. And when you have a local level 4 program, that obviously provides the opportunity for families to make a choice to stay at their local base school to get level 4 services. With respect to other programs, in terms of significant overcrowding, I mean, I think Jeff outlined the process that we currently use really well. Additionally, though, I would say we can continue to have this discussion with board members as part of the ongoing program review that we initiated back in the fall, and we're going to continue that work with the board later this spring after we have our academy and career pathway report completed from some external consultants that we're working at. So there's additional opportunities for board involvement in some of these facilities and program related issues that we're facing as a school system.
Thanks. I think, my frustration is obviously that this is not new. It took us until last year to finally at least balance the 60-40 split of base kid schools versus kids who were transferring into the program. So I would like us to pay some special attention. I did want to ask though, Mr. Plattenberg, I'm sitting with an old CIP, so forgive me with that, but I noticed in the new CIP for Orange Hunt, the numbers have changed significantly. In the 21 to 25 CIP that I have, it's a projection of SY 24-25 at 122% capacity. And I notice in the one that we've just put out, it has the capacity for 26-27 at 107. So I wondered if you could just explain the difference there in the calculation.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we were talking about the contraction and the impact of the pandemic. When you see that significant, we've seen it in a number of different instances. And I don't know, in the case of the German immersion program, I know there are a lot of military personnel who try to get stationed and reside in that Orange Hunt area. So their students can attend that, but I don't know if how much of the migration of the military personnel has been delayed, but in general, that's the contraction that we're speaking about when we talk about the 8,000 or when we talk about the fewer migration in that we have seen in the past. I do believe that it will, this too shall pass, as the Buddhists say. I do believe that there will be, whatever that new normalcy will be, that we will see increases, we will see migration in. But you can see in our new CIP that's not only posted online and also in our dashboard that we're anticipating a continuous contraction Now, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, when there are shifts, whether it's a shift in administration in Washington, D.C., economic shifts, viral shifts, et cetera, we do adjust based upon those, and that's why I love this being an annual review of a 5-year forecast. So you'll see we're contracting all over the place where we were really growing, and I would say, well, we weren't growing great guns, but we were growing significantly. Even at a contracted rate, we were still growing. So you see a difference in that in the CIP this year because we recognize that. We work with financial services as well to make sure that we were all on board with the direction we're heading in. I hope that helps. I don't know if it answers your question.
No, it does. I appreciate that. The next thing I wanted to bring up is Burke School and Key and Kilmer. You know, as we adjust policy, obviously it impacts facilities greatly. We've talked about that with some of the privacy issues in locker rooms and restrooms. And so what have we done? What will we continue to do in schools that were formerly using seclusion? How are we going to, from a facility standpoint, help them implement some of the sensory rooms and different things? I want to make sure that we've really highlighted and put money into changing the structure, because some of those schools are set up in a way that is, it's not what we're doing now with best practices.
Right, and thank you again. Ms. Cohen, I know you've been an advocate and the fact of specifically Burke School and the others in your inquiry and your questions with me in the past. We have made a lot of adjustments to the Burke School. As you mentioned about the restraint and seclusion, we eradicated those rooms. In terms of sensory, we have reached out to the principal to see exactly if there were any outstanding needs that we could look at, and then work with DSS to make sure that we're providing and accommodating what the needs are for the students. Again, with Dr. Boyd and her team, and also our facilities perspective, I believe we can work on a path forward for whatever their requirements are. And as I say, form follows function. So if Dr. Boyd and her team do an assessment and identify the needs, each of the individual principals or program managers of those facilities, you know, their pathway either through the regional assistant superintendent, but also with Dr. Boyd, can make requests of us and we can make accommodations and the like.
Sorry. I would definitely like us to stay on top of that, because I don't see in some of those areas, I think we've like taken some doors off and things, but in terms of transforming those into be, again, really best practices, I think we have a long way to go. And unfortunately, it's only a few places. Ms. Tolan, if you don't mind adding me back, I so appreciate it.
All right, we got you down. Okay, next we have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, followed by Ms. Keys-Gamarra, and then Ms. Barron.
I really appreciate Ms. Cohen. I'll pick up right where she left off, because that was one of the things I wanted to discuss as well. And I think where she's perhaps getting at is that, of course, we can work with Dr. Boyd and her team for specific school needs, Burke School, Key, Kilmer. But I think the bigger picture question is, when we have policy changes, which we do, how do we then look at the broader impact of those policy changes on our facilities policies? So for example, when we change our policies on restraint and seclusion, it isn't just enough to take doors off or, you know, stop using certain spaces, but how do we provide the support and facilities as part of that to help make sure that, one, we abide by our regulations against restraint and seclusion, but also provide ways for those staff to be able to help and the children to be able to help self-regulate. So that's, I think, the broader question, and I'm wondering facilities' role in that.
Yeah, and as I indicated, whether it was directly or not, and we're a supportive role. So getting the proper team, SEPTA, Dr. Boyd, to work to develop, to identify what that may be. I know that Dr. Boyd came here after or in the process of the adjustments that I think it was after actually, when we made those processes of taking doors off and making places accessible so there couldn't be restraining seclusion. That was, in my opinion, a first step in a multi-step process. I don't know that there has been the team coming together to identify, but again, our role is totally supportive. We'll be happy to accommodate any requirements that may be the best practices by the participation of all those groups coming together and identifying what would be in the best interest of our students in those conditions.
Well, it sounds like that perhaps there's room for, oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Ivy.
I was just going to say, I think there's room for further growth in that area, and where the departments, the regions, the schools, and with facilities meets, at least annually or twice a year. I think we can recommend that they meet more often with exactly what you're recommending, with the focus on how can we adapt our facilities to match our new practices.
Thank you. That's actually what I was going to recommend, and perhaps put as a next step is a working group of staff to look not just at new policies, but also bringing in the equity office too. When we talk about inclusive playgrounds and inclusivity, what does that mean? And so I think there's probably room for that collaboration across departments to then help guide facilities as to the facilities needs. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. When you mentioned the JET goals and the workforce development in general, I'm going to put this plug in because I do it every single time. Please reach out to Pulley, Davis, STEP, EFE, WAT programs as well, and make sure that whatever workforce development programs we're putting in place are inclusive and able to be accessed by our special education students to help deal with, first give them skills and also deal with the incredibly high unemployment rate. So it's really important to keep that in mind.
If I could, that's an excellent comment that we need to make sure is at front and center. And perhaps carving out something as a part of the CIP for things such as whatever they may be, current issues du jour, I'll just call them that, or issues unattended to in the past, or unintended consequences such as reflection rooms, bathrooms, spaces within facilities that need to be current and accommodated. Because as I've said, with a 37-year average renovation cycle, it has been a reactive, not proactive process. And with that, the only funding that we've had in the past has been for capacity enhancements, basically partitions closing off rooms, and that's been cut $2 million a year for over like 10 years. But maybe carving out a portion, I think, would be, and Mr. Smith and I were talking about it, might be a good way in the CIP to identify spaces and things that are basically priority lists that we need to address. So it doesn't just happen in a one-off conversation. We don't have a request from a principal that I know Ms. Tolan's been asking about, Ms. Cohen's been asking about, that may have gotten lost in the process. It's codified in our CIP program.
And I think, if we continue with this great collaboration we've had with the county, I think having these conversations with the county as well as we move forward as a society and our definitions of using spaces, inclusivity change, how does that play into how we fund our facilities needs as well? So I think that broader conversation of the definition of facilities needs changes as we change and recognize how we want to, when you talk about all gender bathrooms, right, and reflection spaces, that changes what we define in what we need in a facility. And I think having that broader conversation to even look at the cost is helpful. So having said that, one of the phrases jumped out at me in the presentation, and also around page 42, when you talk about program capacity utilization and solutions for schools that have a capacity deficit. And I think, again, that program review is a really great place to take a look at the impact of our programs on capacity, and also the room for where we may, if we want to expand programs or add new programs, where might be good places to add or expand those when we have capacity deficits. But I'm wondering where the place of SAC is in some of these schools that would have capacity deficits or higher need for SAC programs.
Yeah, the answer on SAC is that, again, we've taken a look at where we had capacity. We worked with SAC. They've identified a number of different locations. We've come up with some creative ways to address it. I know we did down in the Hayfield area. We came working collaboratively to identify spaces to go ahead and accommodate it, but it really is based upon the facility capacity that we currently have, because the needs are much greater than the resources that we have to address it.
I could use a go back, please, Ms. Tolan. Thank you.
I think I'm next.
I'm sorry. I saw you coming on, so I thought you were ready to go. You are next.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this analysis and this opportunity for the community to be able to see this discussion, because it is truly, truly nuanced. And as Mr. Plattenberg said, a 37-year cycle has been difficult to manage. So I want to go back to some of the beginning comments have about 4 points. And I just first want to seek comment on the issue of how our trends, membership trends have changed. As I look at the information that has been provided, it really does look like more that we're dealing with lower birth rates. And also during the pandemic, I think we saw more students seek alternative measures, alternative ways to get an education at the elementary level, which I think may actually have been impacted by the availability of vaccinations, et cetera. So I'd just like to hear Mr. Plattenberg, or I'm sorry, Orsi's comments regarding possibly just kind of further clarifying how we got where we are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. The membership trends, the lower birth rates, that is a factual comment. I mean, we have had, even the birth rate, the birth to kindergarten ratio is up. The birth rates are low. And that's can be confusing for some folks, but the percentage of participants that end up here are up higher than they had been, but the number of births are down. So we've been seeing that. As I mentioned, that's a national trend. And in regards to the alternative ways folks are getting education, perhaps Ms. Cerruti can address that.
Yeah, I think the two biggest things that really stood out in terms of the families who we would understand could probably continue to choose FCPS if they wanted to was the trend for more homeschooling last year and more private schools, both religious and non-religious schools last year. I will say that the trend this year looks much more like it did prior to last year. We need to see whether that continues and really is, when we look at the whole year or across the whole year, whether that's gets us back to sort of where we were before. So it may have just been a one-year phenomenon that happened, but we'll need to double check that at the end of this year to see where we are with it.
It just seemed to me when I looked at the numbers that we were harder hit at the elementary level. I know that this is ongoing, but I think it's important for the community to kind of understand where the primary concerns have been. I do want to support my colleagues in talking about programming. I hope that we as a board, and I know that some things are already scheduled, to look at programming and where it can be through an equity lens. I do not believe that we can build our way out of our capacity issues. And so I'm hoping that our evaluation of programming can help to alleviate some of the stressors that have existed for quite some time. Secondly, utilizing other ways, perhaps, I know some of my colleagues have mentioned specific programs that are only available in certain areas. I'd certainly like to look at whether virtually providing those can help, certainly with, in a different way than we had during the pandemic, but certainly, removing the need to have to live in a particular area. So I'm happy to hear any thoughts on that, if there are any. I think I have 25 seconds. The last comment I want to make has to do with how we make sure the community is a part of this whole conversation. I think that there are a number of folks who feel that they don't understand the queue, they don't understand why their concerns are not being addressed. And I'd like to see how we might improve our communications because this is very difficult and people are having a hard time understanding, and I'm going to need to go back.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a concern in the past, and I can tell you that the Office of Communications under Helen Lloyd is developing additional communication protocols and programs. I do know that we do have these processes, the dates identified for people to be involved in the CIP program. We do have FPAC's involvement and the representatives that are appointed there. We do have the CPDC that does speak to capital and facilities issues. And yet I know, because there are a number of different venues and forays for people to be involved, including our dashboard that's posted online and also the CIP that's online, that it is a voluminous amount of work, and there are certain components that are and as you mentioned, the queue in and of itself. It's articulated in the CIP, but I think the information, the request that Mr. Frisch is speaking of, and you're speaking of as well, I think getting forward momentum on the development of a new queue will allow for even further participation from our constituencies. But I do know that OCCR is working on some additional ways to communicate and to add that inclusivity. And Mr. Smith, I believe, wanted to say something.
And I would just add that there are opportunities for us to continue those conversations. Of course, when you redevelop the queue, the community will be actively involved in that process. But as you think about families leaving Fairfax County and new families coming in, the queue just becomes a, well, this is what it is, versus engaging folks in that conversation so that they can understand as their children are coming into Fairfax County Public Schools as kindergartners, what the impacts of that queue will be as they progress through to high school. So rather than have it be a one-time event when we go through that process, that we have continued conversations about the queue and what the impacts are for their students as they remain in Fairfax County versus just finding out about it when we're going out to RFP for a new queue.
Hello, Happy New Year. I want to, first of all, again, underscore how our Fairfax County taxpayers support our public schools through the bonds that fund this kind of work. So it's just a really important thing we need to keep in mind, that community and voter support. So I want to comment on the program aspect and the facilities needs aspect. So I agree with what's been raised by some of my colleagues regarding the programming. You know, regarding world languages, we found in our program review earlier, well, last year, that there's an inequity in where world language is offered in our elementary schools, and half do not have world language offerings at all. And then we have some that have the FLES, the hour or so a week, and then we have some that are immersion. So as a budget question, I have already submitted a question asking what would it take to provide access to world language in all elementary schools. I think that information is part of what we need to be able to answer questions like, what do we do in schools where there's a hunger for world language and other schools that aren't? I mean, this is a principle we need to come to agreement on if we value world language, then we need to provide access in an equitable way and fund appropriately so for programs and buildings. The second thing I want to talk about is the reflective spaces that was mentioned. I agree, our students are asking for this space where they can go and decompress, de-stress, just catch their breath. It could be inside, it could also be outside, so I really do support us very intentionally planning for reflective spaces. How can we convert current spaces? And that might be akin to those sensory spaces. Do we have ed specs on this kind of space for what our students need? And then finally, with the facility needs, the reflective spaces dovetails nice into my ongoing advocacy for outdoor learning spaces. This, in addition to our move to strengthen how we teach literacy, is my biggest priority around getting access to outdoor learning spaces for our students. I've already submitted a budget question that is asking to look at, again, the equity of it, which facilities have outdoor learning space and which do not. I'm aware that our Get to Green staff do have a list of this, and this will be refreshed through a survey in March to schools, so we'll be able to see what the current level is, because the data we have now is a little bit dated. But this is something that we need to plan for. I know, Mr. Plattenberg, you've been super excited, super champion for this. This also extends for me into outdoor play spaces, not only for our elementary school kids, but our middle schoolers and also our high schoolers. What could be some places that they can refresh, get active when they have a break, or just have some downtime? So that, in addition to bathrooms being appropriately built where they need to, inside and on fields with a county support, and also solar, are things I'm all interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. McLaughlin, please, and then followed by Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. I'd like to kind of turn and focus a little bit more on what Ms. Keys-Gamarra might have been trying to get at, but certainly what I'd like to emphasize, which is how do we help make sure that today's report and the data that's been gathered by ORC is really fully understood by our community. And I say that because as we emerge from the pandemic, as we look at the enrollment that is the lowest it's been since I joined the board 10 years ago, and that drop-off of 10,000 students, that's real. And if we're not more effective in how we communicate that, the narrative continues out there. And it's not just who's on social media talking about it. I mean, I'm hearing it in my communities. People are hearing the chatter, and if we're not doing a better job, then they're just listening to the chatter and the speculation. So I do think that, you know, on the one hand, thank you so much, ORC. Leedy, really appreciate the information you guys pulled. But Dr. Brabrand, you also know one of the things that I really hope we will continue to get better at is not just providing the data, but really having very clear, very intentional analysis of what the data is telling us. And some of these PowerPoint slides still are de minimis of information. I'm trying to see if I can pull one that in particular caught my eye. Slide 4, you know, how does FCPS trend line compare with those of Virginia and the national school divisions? This was something that, if I recall, Mr. Plattenberg, when we talked about in going through this presentation, it was trying to make sure that we really did help create that important context so people aren't looking at us in a vacuum in our drop-in numbers. So I think that this is a slide that tells a really important picture, but that information isn't clear. I'm personally not a huge fan of the whiskers type graphs. I think that is for, you know, statisticians and not lay people. But that one I would really recommend that OCCR work with the team, Dr. Brabrand, because that's crucial. In my last 30 seconds, so I'm gonna obviously need to go back. I do want to touch on this in my go back for everybody. The fact of the matter is even though we brought some families back, and that's the good news, the concerning news to me is that even pre-pandemic, the percent of families that have chosen private school in Fairfax County and the percent of families who've chosen homeschooling over Fairfax County is double what it was in the pandemic. So even though we had a big spike up, when we came back down, we have not closed the gap. So you're looking at twice the number. And I think that is conversation we need to discuss some more. I appreciate the go back.
And Ms. McLaughlin, I would say that you're exactly right in terms of owning that narrative. And I will say that Ms. Lloyd and her team have done such a wonderful job of helping us own our narrative much better as a school system. And so there are opportunities for us to take this language, take this information, and repackage it. I know that when we were developing the strategic plan so many years ago, we often had to run everything through a plain language machine. And so we created that plain language machine ourselves so that the community would have a better sense of what we were talking about. So as we look at the report that Ms. Haruda and her team have recently developed, as we look at the CIP, it's how do we take all of that information, run it through the plain language machine so that our community has a better understanding. And so again, they aren't coming up with their own conclusions about why students may not be here in Fairfax County. We can't just say that students left. We can say that students aren't here. We know that because of this report, many students didn't actually arrive. So how do we control that narrative? Working very closely with our communications team will help us get a better handle on that.
Ms. Karski?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Ms. Marin and what you said, Mr. Plattenberg, about the infusion of money from the Board of Supervisors and the partnership that they've shown with us. You know, it's crucial, and I am very appreciative of it, and I just wanted to say that, and to our colleagues who worked on that joint CIP. I think lots of good comments have been made I do have some questions around some of these smaller boundary adjustments that we've done, in the past. I know they would probably fall under the administrative boundary approach to fix some of these small feeders. Where are we with that right now? I mean, I know we've halted them. Are we just not doing anything? Everything is on pause until further notice? Is that still the best thinking with where you all are?
Yes, currently we are on pause, on hold for any type of adjustments. The thinking was that the presentation from the boundary consultant was going to inform the development of the school board's policy on boundaries prior to us initiating any additional work. The question was asked, where are we on this? And I think a clarification was provided. So my team is going to make a staff recommendation about the report. And interestingly enough, it really aligned with the presentation that we had provided some time back, actually, when we did a national study of similar-sized districts and came back with our analysis. That's reassuring on the one hand, but on the other, it begs us to go ahead and take a look at how we're going to manage moving forward for that. I can't speak for the superintendent on what that recommendation is really going to be ultimately when we come back through. But for now, it is that things are on hold, because where would the priorities be? Would the priorities be for what you alluded to about those feeders, those smaller feeders? Would it be the individual islands that we have within some pyramids? What would the criteria be, and what would the priorities be? Certainly, if the body chose to develop or direct staff through the superintendent on a path forward, we definitely could do it, because keep in mind, when we put this on pause collectively, we identified individual projects that were still to be done. And we, in fact, have done so and are in the process of doing the finalization of the other ones that were as a part of that. So we're open to direction on that, but we're currently on pause until staff makes a recommendation through the superintendent on the interpretation of the boundary consultant's work.
Okay, that's fine. There were just some.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention.
Oh.
And I apologize.
That's okay.
The fact that we've had this pandemic and things have been really mysterious from an enrollment standpoint, the colleagues I speak to in Prince William and also Loudoun, they're looking at pause on a lot of this stuff too, because the data isn't as informing as we believe it really should be. It may be the new normal, we just don't know yet. So for us to make changes during this time, notwithstanding the islands and the split feeders and so on, is not a bad time to be sitting there and figuring out your path forward, including all the comments about inclusivity, equity, communication, and outreach. I just want to add that, sorry.
Yeah, sure. But I guess we're going to have to move on that sooner than later. Anyway, I won't go too far down that path. I have some questions I think we can talk about later. The Western High School, it was brought up. I've brought it up repeatedly to you. It's difficult to go back to the community year after year and talk about how this overcrowding on a regional level continues and is continuing, and I understand what you're talking about, how we've seen some shifts and, will these shifts be large enough to actually have any impact? But I'll say for my students, in my district, every single school almost that my constituents attend is overcrowded. And the one that isn't, Westfield, well, I'll just say it's quite close to being overcrowded, and if you've walked those hallways during a course change, you may have a different opinion on that. So my advocacy is, and my question is, what do I go back and say to my constituents who ask about this? Because even when we look at how long it will take between site acquisition and actual building, that's years and years and years. Yes, things can change. We'll know better after the pandemic, all of these other factors that you've addressed. But if we don't get a jump on it sooner than later, it's not a solution or something that the community can really accept. So how far, if we started, if we made it a priority and started soon, how long into the process before the process can't be stopped? I guess that is a question. Does that make sense?
I'm trying to wrap my heads around how long into the process before the process can't be stopped. When you talk about new construction of a school, for example.
Yeah, that's what I'm
The
talking
design, okay, thank you. That's what I thought you meant. And you mentioned correctly, when you talk about the design of a high school, we talked about the Western High School. The design of that high school will take 2 years, every bit. And that design process includes basically going ahead and going through an RFP process, selecting, which we do as a part of our bond referendum, and the prioritization of those projects, which are in the CIP, and the board can direct that we go ahead and accelerate the new Western High School, because if you look at the CIP, you can see where that falls in the timeline that we have and the expenditures associated with it. If there's a desire to move that forward beyond what staff's recommendation is in the current CIP, then the subsequent or corresponding timeline to that would be able to be accelerated. Again, the timeline, however, the design alone is 2 years approximately. We go through a process like any developer through the county design review process. That's design development. Any construction design includes initial conceptual development, schematic designs, design development, construction document development. There's an 85% development before the full development of the documents that then go out to bid. They go out to bid and then are on the street for 60 to 90 days. Then the respondents, the bidders, offers come in. Our process of doing it is this process. And then the construction begins, and a high school renovation takes 4 years. New construction may take 2.5 to 3, probably 3.5 years for a new high school to be built. That's when you have the site. We don't even have the site. So the site on this, we do have land, but that land's being utilized by community, and I think based upon our past experience, our process would need to cast a broader net of looking at creative opportunities for how to address the location of this facility. Many of you have asked me about that. So that process in and of itself really protracts the timeline that we're speaking of. So when you're talking, let's say 4 years to build a new high school, let's just say 3. 3 years to build a new high school, 2 years of design, 5, plus the process to go ahead and get the bidding and everything like that, you're talking 6 years. And I'm not being really conservative.
I'm done. Okay, and we haven't started it. Thanks, Jace. Okay, I'll take a go back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have Ms. Derna Kofax.
Tammy, you're on mute.
Fairfax, you're muted. You need to take your mute off.
I gotcha. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. I forgot how to use my Zoom. It's been so long. So anyways, what I was saying, Mr. Plattenberg, thank you and your team for putting this together. Each year it continues to expand and enhance with the details, and I do appreciate that very much. I will start off with some in the region that I represent, Region 3. And I did notice, those pyramids collectively were 8, 6, 9%, the trend that, of numbers going down. So I understand your analysis to this point. The one thing I want to ask you particularly about Region 3, have you looked at what potential embark numbers could do within this region?
We have taken a look at the embark numbers, and we also have identified, when the county folks came and spoke, both in the zoning and the planning development came and spoke, I believe there was some information included in that as well. We anticipate that we're definitely going to see, and I'll call it positive impact of growth in enrollment numbers throughout the Embark area, all the new revisioning areas that I alluded to, and I was remiss in not, I mentioned Mount Vernon Alexander, but I didn't mention Embark specifically.
Okay, and can you, for the public, just talk about the span of time that Embark will, the years it will span?
Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can say this to the public, that it is going to be an ongoing, continuous impact. It is evolving much like many of the other areas of redesign have been, where there's been initial plans and then additional plans for further growth and then the subsequent impacts of that, where new submittals come on because of the envisioning that goes on in one area. It's not just what we know about now, but it's also I'll call them the positive unintended consequences of continuous growth that are an offshoot of a program as viable as the Embark program is.
Okay, all right, thank you. My second comment is on what several of my colleagues have brought up. And I'm particularly interested in the sensory hallways, sensory rooms in elementary schools. Do you have, or does our instructional services program have any details on the numbers of elementary schools that have those places within the building?
No, we don't have it from facility standpoint, but I don't know. I would presume that Dr. Boyd may, but we can put that down as a follow-up to see what we do and don't have.
I think that's really important because when we talk about accommodations and equity issues, many children have sensory integration issues in elementary schools that through proactive occupational therapy via a school setting can really positively impact children with learning issues, social emotional issues, as well as behavioral issues. So I think that, and that was emerging years ago. I think it's a best practice now. And I think our facilities, as we grow, need to include opportunities for that to help our children, because I think that's extremely important. Also, my colleagues who spoke about the inequity in world languages. We're getting into programming here, but programming affects facilities, so I wanted to talk about that. And I guess my last question, it's kind of a comment, and I don't even expect an answer to this, but because we see growth in some areas and we see numbers going down in other areas. And I think the system as a whole has to take a deep dive on the whys behind that, not just membership, but programming, facilities, and whether or not it's true reputation of schools and different pyramids. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief because as a meeting manager, I did have a more in-depth conversation with Mr. Plattenberg earlier and the team. I want to first thank you for all of your work in this year's CIP, but really how you have led the development of a more comprehensive CIP over time. It's greatly appreciated. And adding the enrollment piece this year has been a real added plus, and I would hope that going forward we would always do that. Next, I think that we've spoken about this for the past several years, but we really have not brought the ed spec to this board so that the board better understands what is included in the ed spec and what the FCPS promise is meant to be for each and every one of our schools. Because what we do know is that the ed spec gets upgraded, and those that are in the queue then get the new shiny penny of the ed spec, but those that might have a 37-year renovation cycle have a long time to wait before those upgrades are made. So in looking at not only the renovation queue, we need to address how do we keep all of our schools current so that we don't have situations where there is an impression that if you go to one school versus another, you get better quality classrooms or labs and things like that. Secondly, in looking at our enrollment and our capacity, I think that we need to look at some additional things, which are the impact of the study that we're doing on special ed and the recognition that we are not doing as much inclusion in our base schools as we should be. And so really looking at that as something of the future. And then third, I did want to just address Ms. Derenak-Kovac's question about Embark Richmond Highway. It's my understanding that the low-end estimates are 11,500 new students that will come out of Embark Richmond Highway. And that the challenge is that our school system doesn't count those students in our capacity planning until shovel has turned. And we do know that there are a number of areas where that shovel is just starting to turn. And this summer, we're going to see the first one being the realization of North Hill, which is a very substantial development.
Well, and I'd like to add that the build-out forecast of that is the year 2040. So yeah, we're going to be seeing not only that initial impact of the large build-out initially, but also over time.
Ed spec, if you would find a way of sharing that with us, we'd really appreciate it.
What I'd like to say about the ed spec part, there are 16 different divisions in the construction program design documents by the master standards. That includes everything from concrete to steel structure, et cetera. And that's what's incorporated within these educational specifications. But what I feel the opportunity is to articulate the spaces and areas, especially the changes that have happened over time. Whatever they may be, so that we can bring them before this body. And I'll go ahead and request my team to go ahead and figure out a way to make that information viable and available. And I do believe as a conversation as a part of the FPAC and CPDC, that could be definitely focus work and targeted for those groups to make sure that there's clear articulation, not only with the appointees and the volunteers of our community, but also the board members that serve on those. And then for a recommendation from them is what may be a better way, venue to make this board available of what's in those actual educational specifications. And the point is valid. When there are changes that are made to the educational specification, security vestibules is one that I'll use. They're incorporated with all of our new designs. We do not have security vestibules in all of our schools. So, that's a perfect example. So anything that comes up that is incorporated within our facilities then becomes the standard. And it's not, for those schools that were finished prior to that becoming the standard, it's not until that cycle comes back around. So your point is well made.
Okay, thank you. I would like to make a couple of comments, and as long as we're talking bathrooms and 37-year renovation queues, I've had many conversations with facilities, and I just said, well, throw it out. We really need to make sure that we have bathrooms in our educational facilities. So I will be following up with facilities once again on that. I do want to follow up on Mr. Frisch's comments around the renovation queue list. As the author of the motion he's talking about from 2 years ago, I don't really know what the upsides are to delaying the work around the renovation queue. I think that if we can do this work, it will only help us to be more transparent with our community as we've been talking. I know it's a very, very difficult and there are lots of nuances to, what happens around that renovation queue, but I think this can help us to really be clear about what the criteria are, how we can move forward, and where schools will fall that are not in the list of 63 schools that we have on page 38 now that have, is our current renovation queue. So I would certainly support bringing in a consultant to move that work forward if that's the best way to do that. Along those lines, too, I just want to talk a little bit about our schools with.
Ms. Tolan, if I could, just on that comment, as you're thinking about next steps, if that's the next step that the board wants, because I've heard it from a few board members, perhaps that's something at the close of this work session. I know you all do the next step analysis. That's something we can work with Mr. Plattenberg on, because I do hear the board saying an urgency to set the groundwork, especially as a new superintendent comes in, that this work needs to continue to move forward. So we'll certainly take board feedback after this work session about working, getting a consultant to get things going in that direction. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a fan of looking at all of your maps. Thank you so much for the volume of maps in the CIP. I focus mainly on the maps that are capacity deficits without modular. Because we do understand that our modulars are temporary facilities to help us in situations like McLean High School where we have overcrowding. Just looking at page 102 on that map there, when I look at numbers like without modular down the road, projections of McLean at 121%, Chantilly 132%, Centerville 131%. I really hope that we can look at, as Ms. Carsey was talking about, that Western High School perhaps for that, area of the county. But I know we've been working on another motion that I had 2 years ago also was to really look at developing a consistent method for protecting student enrollment. And I know we've currently been working on the student yield formula. And I wanted to just get an update from you on maybe where that work is.
I'm sorry, I'm going to let Mr. Schuster go ahead and answer because I know I would butcher it.
And Pranita's also on the line virtually, but as you know, it went to CPDC, and then from there, I believe the schools committee or the planning commission would need to review that, and then it would need to go on to the board of supervisors before it were adopted for any of the process for development review.
Okay, thank you. I'll work with.
And by the way, the county and the division council are reviewing our recommendations as well.
Okay, good. All right, I'll follow up on that. I just hope, we were talking about communication, and I know, Mr. Frisch and I have a group that for the Tysons area, similar to Embark, we've got numbers like we're talking about at Embark in the Tysons development impacting a number of high schools in that, that particular area, including McLean, Marshall, et cetera. I just really hope that we started putting together some materials to help communicate to the public about how this process works and to make it a little bit more clear for the public. So I hope we can work together to really continue that process. And I do want to credit McLean Citizens Association for doing a lot of work on helping us look at the development numbers in Tysons, along with Ms. Gillis and Brian. And we want to pick that work back up. And I think it will be helpful for many areas of the county. Okay, I went over time actually, but we have had everyone speak. We have a number of people with go-backs. The meeting was, of course, set to end at 1 p.m. So I think what we would like to do is limit go-backs to 2 minutes if we can, and hopefully very quickly go through those. So Dr. Anderson, you're at the top of the list for go-backs.
Hi, thank you. Going back to the membership analysis on page 7, where you have about 5,400 kids who are withdrawn or other, do we have any sense of who these kids are? Because I'm trying to find a way to grasp this information. I know we don't know where they've gone, but who are they?
When you, I just want to make sure I understand. Are you asking in terms of like demographically who they
Yes.
are? Or
Anything that you have, are they high
we
schools,
did,
are they
we
middle
have
schools,
not,
are they?
yeah, we have not dug into that more deeply than what's kind of on this graph. I can tell you they're basically students that are removed by the schools because they haven't attended for a certain length of time and are withdrawn, or they withdraw and the families do not provide any more specific reason than sort of a general withdrawal. But that would be something that could be looked into more deeply.
I would definitely be adding that as one of my next steps. I won't waste time in speculating since we don't have that information. Secondarily, Mr. Plattenberg, I think we've talked previously in terms of how it would be helpful to transportation and all the needs that are impacting your shop to have more than the depots that currently exist. Two things. Can you, one, kind of alert everybody to what that conversation has been? And two, where does that fit in the grand scheme of all this conversation and all of our joint work with the county?
Well, great question, thank you. And I didn't ask you to ask this, but I will tell you, we're way behind other jurisdictions. Montgomery County has depots. You can service and manage your buses. If you have issues, you have the mechanics right there and the trays right there to go ahead and do that. You have much less downtime. We have a wider surplus fleet that we carry and have to maintain because of our disparate locations. We work real well with the county DVS, who is basically a subcontracted maintainer of our buses and our bus fleet, but we don't have enough depots. We certainly just don't have enough places to park. I've worked with the current chair of the Board of Supervisors on trying to identify space and localities over the years. He's been a proponent of trying to assist us with identifying that. There are certain criteria for spaces for vehicles when you accommodate the what's considered hazardous material and the waste that comes off of the vehicles and so forth. But Loudoun County has the ability to address, Prince William has the ability to address, Montgomery County has the ability to address their fleet. It makes for a much more efficient operation, as I oversaw not only the school bus fleet, but also the refuse and the entire garage for the county for Loudoun when I was there. That was part of the role of the school system assistant superintendent. And I can tell you, it made my life a lot easier. I had more hair then. So.
Well,
Thanks for asking that.
I will definitely add this also to
So
a next
where is it in the
step, because
CIP?
I want to know how
does
do
it
we
fit in?
embed it in our processes so that we move forward.
As I mentioned, carving out that Mr. Smith and I were talking about for sensory rooms and things like that, this may be a perfect place for something like that. It is not included in our CIP. If it is, it's an ancillary comment. I've made it before when I first got here to make it included in that, but I think perhaps highlighting something, bifurcation of a section that would identify those ongoing needs so that they don't get lost in the shuffle.
Definitely, and I see a space for there, as Ms. Sizemore-Heiser talked about, if we're having employment opportunities for students, having those places be more accessible really does help. Very quickly, I didn't realize that Dr. Presidio was on the call. Dr. Presidio, can you kind of give a quick update, if you can, as to where your shop is regarding the middle school AAP Center Forum topic staff response?
Sure. So that item actually came to the board back in 2020 and has been sitting on the queue to be scheduled for a school board work session. So whenever that's scheduled for a work session is when staff would be prepared to present.
Okay, well, we are dying with, bated breath here to have that be scheduled. My last thing, and Dr. Brabrand, you're not going to be surprised at all by this, because every time we talk about CIP, I bring this up, the survey for Paul Glasgow and Holmes. I understand from our last meeting in December, you said there would be a white paper provided in January, and subsequently that would result in the survey to our communities, and which will impact all of this work. So I would love an update as to where we are, any steps of this process.
Yeah, on behalf of Dr. Brabrand, I'd just like to say that the capacity was the instructional services folks had finished their work. We have concluded our work as well, and now it has to be, I've requested that we have a meeting at the cabinet level to discuss the resultant effect of our data and ISD's data so that we can provide you with that white paper that you speak of.
Okay, so timeline for the survey, because I get asked every day.
I'm hopeful. The Friday or the Thursday of that board meeting right before winter break is before we got flooded over the winter break with Omicron. So I think late January to early February, no later than February 15th. That's my direct answer.
Okay, I've got a roundtable meeting happening. I will be serving up that date.
Serve it up. We'll have it done.
Thank you.
Ms. Cohen?
I'd be remiss if I didn't say go dogs, first of all. I can't get through one of these meetings without mentioning the Clifton Elementary School site, Mr. Plattenberg. Recently there was some consternation about some of the changes that we have to make as long as it's being used as community use. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on what are the possibilities, knowing what you know about that site. And when we keep talking about needing space, is there a possibility that we can transform that into something that would be helpful to FCPS?
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Yeah, we have a copy of the consultant study that was done of that site that I will be bringing forward to the board. I haven't presented that yet to the superintendent and cabinet. In terms of what the recommended use or not for that space. I can tell you the difficulty and the challenge of that space, the location, the area it would serve, and also the site constraints in and of itself. But you are correct. We have been having to maintain the interior of that building has been without heat or air conditioning since the closure, and we've maintained the fields and the playground. Community use does use the field with the playground and then the basketball hoops and so forth that you brought to my attention. We've been maintaining that, but then we made the inadvertent effect of locking the gates so nobody could use it. So we do own that, and I've spoken to my teams to make sure the community can still use it. But again, we have to come back with that recommendation, and that should be coming shortly.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I did just want to flag, piggybacking a little bit on Ms. Pekarsky's comments. Even pre-pandemic, during pandemic, if we ever get post-pandemic, we do know some things are universally true with some of our schools, Chantilly, Centerville being well over capacity. And so is there going to be a recommendation that's brought forward, like either to move the academy to something different in Chantilly, or are we talking about we're going to need a third floor at Centerville because we don't have a big footprint? Again, to Ms. Pekarsky's point, we've got to get some idea of where is the relief going to happen. And even if it is however many years down the road, my fear is that Centerville winds up being like our West Springfield renovation that's wonderful, but still opened over capacity. So where can we give our community some solace there?
Yeah, I don't know that I can address the programming piece, and perhaps Dr. Pursuta can address that. But I will say that in terms of Centerville High School, we do have it listed as part of a renovation. It was included in the bond referendum to address the capacity. But I think that ties into the whole conversation that Ms. Pekarsky and the others have brought up about when and the timing of the new high school. Chantilly, there isn't a solution. I know people ask and say, hey, we need to take a look at these facilities without the modulars. The modulars, from a facility standpoint, are a capital investment. They're over $3 million. So therefore, they are viewed from the physical plant standpoint as meeting the needs of the constituency and the community, even though they're not the most desirable. So if you look at a pyramid or a hierarchical pyramid, you would see at the top, at the heap of the top, at the tip of that pyramid, you would see a capital construction, bricks and mortar. Under that, you would see a modular. Under that, you would see double wides, and then under that, you would see trailers. That's not a desirable pyramid, but it is the way that we do business here, again, with the funding resources that we've had, the limited funding resources, even though we're making improvements upon that. Chantilly, I don't have a real answer for that yet in terms of the program. I do know there are a number of programs at Chantilly. We've been working with Dr. Boyd's team, as we alluded to make sure we meet the needs of the students where they're coming from. where we can provide those needs, rather than the legacy system of schools that either had space or had administrations that were supportive of having those programs located there, even though it wasn't in close proximity to the residing student body. So we're looking at all of those things, but I don't have a clear answer for you right now at this time.
I would just say to my colleagues and to you as well, I think we also, when we talk about capacity, have really got to have a real serious conversation about best practices in education. We got Chantilly with 3,000 kids almost, just shy. That is not a model that is the right thing for our students. So I would just put that out to my colleagues that needs to be a consideration as we go forward.
Ms. Seismer-Heiser, followed by Karen Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll be quick. I said a couple extra things that I wanted to ask about. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the migration in and out of Fairfax County. And I know obviously things are still up in the air around that, but what I've seen sort of in trends in other areas that are high cost of living with remote working is that people have moved out of the area to be able to work remotely in areas that are less expensive. I'm wondering if that's something that you looked at in looking at our migration reasons.
For this report, it's not something that we've looked at, but we did talk about the issue that economic impact might have had on students who had left last year in particular, but it's not something that was specifically looked at. And if you'll just kind of give me 1 second of grace, I wanted to go back to something that Dr. Anderson had asked about in terms of the withdrawn students. I wanted to add into that just that it also includes students who leave and don't go on to any other kind of schooling, so potentially are leaving for jobs or other issues related to it as well. So I apologize for
Please.
Going off.
No, it's all good. I just think that, as we're looking at different migration reasons, looking at sort of what's going on in the 21st century, I know there was a study that said that, the San Francisco Bay Area may lose half of its population, and people are moving to Idaho and Montana because of cost of living. So I wonder if that's an impact here as you're looking long-term trends for renovations.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point, because when we look at the data we have, that we have access to, is IRS, and really when you look at census data and IRS data, but that's always, as we know, lags. It's delayed, so we don't have the immediacy, the dynamic environment to know what the true impacts are right away.
And I understand that it's difficult it's just something to think about as we're looking at this. And in addition, sort of what the decrease in the birth to kindergarten ratio has and decrease in births may have on that renovation queue that we have listed, right? There's several high schools on there, but what is the long-term impact there as well? And that's one thing I wanted to ask you about. When you're looking, I agree with Ms. Tolan. I think it is important to look at a renovation queue, and I think it's important to maybe even look at what factors go into determining that renovation queue, which I know is all part of that conversation. But how do we look at, with a 37-year renovation cycle, how are we looking at making sure we have that balance between the major renovations and smaller renovations, especially in this era of COVID, when we realize how important it is to have, really well-working, HVAC systems and things like that? How does that balance currently play into the renovation queue, and is there space to re-looking at that balance?
Yeah, there's always opportunities, but what we've broken it down is you've got the renovation queue, and that's sacrosanct. That's something that the board has throughout time approved the independent analysis of the facilities to go ahead and accommodate and set that up, and that was the driver for our CIP, that and the capacity additions to address enrollment growth trends. When you talk about how do we go ahead and do iterative improvements, that is our major maintenance program, and that's the way we've been able to address it. Now, fortunately, we've received a lot of money through these programs, through ESSER funding, et cetera, and grants that we've applied to go ahead and get a lot of our HVAC upgrades. I've stated it before, we have about $240 million backlog in capital facilities. We are going to be getting a program of basically $230 million a year eventually. But that's today's dollars of our backlog, and that's on renovation. When you take a look at HVAC and major maintenance, we have over $200 million backlog as well. In fact, we talk about the current replacement value, which is the international or national standard for what you invest in your capital facilities. That is 2 to 4% of your total asset valuation, meaning the value of all of your buildings and all your facilities. you should be budgeting 2 to 4%. We have been budgeting, because of the conditions that we described, the need being greater than the resources, at 0.014. We're nowhere near where we need to be, is the bottom line. So this infusion that we've had lately, right? So you had staff that we were short of, that it's been proven on our maintenance and our trades and everything, that was proven by independent audits. I've talked about this, where we're 260 positions down. And then we get this infusion, which is great. And we get the positivity of the joint body identifying additional resources, which is moving in the right direction. But we don't have the staff right now and the capacity. We're doing really well. We've set up programs to be able to accommodate and roll out these programs, because there's a shot clock on a lot of them. So we're making sure that we're addressing. So we're very fortunate in that our major maintenance is able to address it. But that's where those components of bringing things current, whatever it may be, we identified security vestibules of $15 million that we needed that were outstanding. Same thing we talked about with stadium bathrooms. Same thing we talk about with different issues that come up that the board wants us to address. We're hearing about bathrooms now and how that needs to be something that's outside of. That's why we talked about how we could put a segment in the CIP that identifies those things that are high priority from the community, from the board, and therefore for staff in the direction of our work.
Great. I appreciate that very informative explanation, actually. But in my 19 seconds, I'll just say that I think it's important when we're looking at ed specs and renovation queues to look at what COVID has taught us in terms of the needs for facilities, right? Especially the need for airflow, and as we're looking for additional renovations. And I'm just going to put in my last 5 seconds, really please look at internships for Pulley, Davis, and STEP. Those places are always looking for internships, and you seem to always be looking for staff. So I think that's a great opportunity. Thank you.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, did you want to go back?
Yes, I'm sorry. I did put most of my concerns in the next steps, but I will say this, Dr. Brabrand and Mr. Plattenberg, given the conversation we've had today, and I think having gone through the pandemic, we've seen, new urgency, as well as the community being concerned about these topics, which is why I will be working with our CPDC committee, as well as Ms. Tolan and FPAC, to try to figure out how those committees can help facilitate this conversation. I do think it's just too much, Mr. Plattenberg. I do really appreciate all the work that your staff has been able to do, but I do think that perhaps our committees can help facilitate, especially in the communications of how we make recommendations for priorities in terms of how we are communicating with the community. So hopefully we can have further discussions on that, because I think we're sort of at a point where it's all hands on deck. And I look forward to those discussions to try to figure out how those committees, we can all work together to help improve on community understanding, because I don't think there's a quick fix. So I'll just make that comment.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Bakarski.
I want to quickly capture something that Ms. Keys-Gamarra just said, because it's something I've shared with Mr. Plattenberg through 3 different superintendents over the last decade. Mr. Plattenberg, you have a massive shop with a massive responsibility between transportation and facilities. And my concern, even just with today's presentation, is there's no less than probably 15 to 20 different topics and areas of concern, buckets you can put some of this into, including one that I don't think we've had much conversation about, which is where we place our programs, even for elementary school, local level for AAP. Until such time, how much are we spending every year when we are busing kids out of their neighborhood schools and going into the centers, or busing them to any of the other wonderful programs we have, like language immersion? It's not a stovepipe. So the facilities, the transportation costs, the impact to programming, they're all intertwined. And I guess I would say, Dr. Brabrand, I almost feel like the 12 of us are going to struggle here, because I almost feel as if your team, your cabinet, has got to look at this a little more intentfully, which I know is hard because we're dealing with COVID, and the first thing is how do we keep kids in schools, and I'm grateful to your commitment for that. But since we are in a transition with you retiring, a new superintendent coming in, the fact that we're not going to be doing typical sort of boundary changes that we usually have in a queue, Mr. Plattenberg, I've always supported if you need more people in your team, more directors, but in the end, we've got to have people for each one of these areas that can report back up to Mr. Plattenberg, that report back up to you, because this work's got to get done. And I really do want to say to my colleagues, each one of you have given some thoughtful input here today. But, you know, I'm kind of leaving here not even sure strategically, and I don't necessarily want to go do this at the board table, but I feel like there's been a lot of really good discussion, but not a lot of clear direction and how we would even take where all of our observations are. And I think we really need that.
Ms. Pekarsky?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I need somebody to.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an answer.
Okay.
I'm giving you an answer. Here's the bottom line. One, we are in a crisis, and we've had our schools open through this surge that no one expected, and I'm proud that we had an amazing opening yesterday. Our attendance was great. Our central office completely deployed in schools, covered every classroom. I think we're doing the best in the nation, frankly, right now in keeping our schools open and minimizing drama for kids and keeping our classrooms open. But you're right, Ms. McLaughlin, we've got key priorities on the CIP. Jeff said the big nugget a little bit ago. We should have money to do first of all, in my time here, after a decade of flat CIP staffing, we got 25 million more right out of the gate. And then through the work that this board has done and collaborating with the Board of Supervisors, another 50 million coming in the next 2 years. It's still a drop in the bucket for what we've needed to both speed up the queue, which is what everybody wants to do here, and deal with some of this preventive maintenance that has backlogged to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And now what are the priorities to get those done? So I heard a couple of things today that I actually think there is some consensus on, but obviously, you know, I defer to Ms. Corbett Sanders and Ms. Tolan. A next step to let's get the consultant and get moving on looking at this queue. I'm ready to support that. We got 6 months. I can get that off the table so the new superintendent doesn't even have to go back to it. The other is, and I do need a little bit of time, but you could generally do it, is I heard Marty and Jeff talk about let's peel a little bit of money off the CIP and address some of these other priorities. Bathrooms, reflection rooms, calm down rooms, special ed pieces, maybe some of this, the new ed specs that some of the schools 10 years ago don't have. We can figure out the dollar amount. Just you give support that a little bit of that being peeled off is a good idea, and then we can come up with a proposal in the next few weeks. And then, when we can come up with the amount of money, don't have to worry about prioritizing yet. We know you have 3 or 4 key things, and then we can figure out a detailed plan on those. That's my best thinking from listening to today. That will keep forward motion going. You okay with that, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I did want one clarity from Mr. Plattenberg. Mr. Plattenberg, you know, we're talking about the consultant, but one of the things I guess I would just really hope for the board and the public is, so we're covering all these areas that we think need attention. This is the cold, hard question. Are you lacking staff to manage all these plates in the air? And is that something that as we're going into budget, we really need to think about setting your department, your team, and the next superintendent up for success? Okay. Apparently, they raised it because they're also the budget chair and co-chair, but I'd like to have you answer just that one thing.
I love the backing of the budget co-chair and chair to go ahead and support that. I will say the funding for, as I mentioned, the incremental increase from the 25 million to 50 million, it's articulated in the CIP over the time frame that funding stream is going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight. The beauty of it is our bond funding program pays for the staff associated with the bond program. So the funding for additional staff will be a part of that. So that piece will be included in those additional funds that do come. In regards to our major maintenance and that program, yes, I've already spoken to Mr. Moss to identify, as we do each year. I mentioned we were 260 tradespeople down, and that's from a 2013 study, and we've grown approximately 300,000 to 500,000 square feet, average 250,000 square feet, which is a small high school, each year in space, without growing our formula for custodians and without growing our maintenance or trades personnel. The reality is the needs and the funding that we had available did not allow us collectively to fund those positions. We will continue to ask for those, and I will identify what those needs are as a part of the next upcoming budget process. The board has prioritized the needs for additional staffing for school counselors, psychologists. We've gotten additional security personnel for tabletops. We've gotten additional folks in the capacity analysis in our facilities planning that we're extremely grateful, but it's because of those competing needs. But we will identify, to your point, what it would take to go ahead and do this appropriately. We currently have a game plan. We're going to do it no matter what, but I think it will facilitate a better execution and timeline of a lot of the major maintenance accommodations if we fund it appropriately in terms of staff.
And I would also add that across all of our operational departments, we're seeing some of these same kinds of deficiencies in terms of staffing. And so in addition to bringing forward information about specifically what's happening in facilities and transportation, I would like to bring something forward to the board that has a focus on some of the impacts that we're seeing across our operations in general.
Ms. Prakarsky, followed by Ms. Amish.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, one thing, and Dr. Anderson, I know some others brought this up, but the net migration changes this year, I would just like to underscore the importance of us getting that kind of granular analysis, because I know in the Westfield pyramid, we also happen to have a large swath of parents who are very concerned with the pandemic and preferred virtual learning. And I just, I'd like to understand where they may be kept home and what kind of impact did those types of issues have on it, and which kids, which areas, were there specific areas that had more impact than others. So I would really appreciate that so I can understand it just a little bit better. Thank you. No, I put it in next steps.
Got in next steps. Okay, great.
Okay, three things just real quick. One is, since we kind of came up with a list in response to Ms. McLaughlin, I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose sight of the boundary policy conversation that we had in the beginning, coming forward with a draft perhaps, or having a next step as we schedule out with the board leadership what the next step from that consultant presentation would be. So Dr. Braybrand, want to make sure you heard that.
Yeah,
Draft boundary policy.
If I could do that, I made the statement that staff will be making a recommendation based upon what we felt that was for the board to consider, and we'll bring that. I brought that up, and I think that would be a part of the next step, that we'll make a recommendation based upon the consultant's report and their recommendations in their report as to the way we should move forward for the board's consideration.
Okay, thank you. Second thing was, as we started having some conversations here, budget-wise and everything, elevating needs, I just want to make sure we develop some framework of how we prioritize these things. I again, from an equity standpoint, it continues to concern me that we perceive a need in a certain area, it comes forward, maybe a board member will bring something up, but what is the systemic way of making sure that we're doing this with full context and an understanding of equity? So I just put that out there for people to remember or consider. And then finally, since there was a lot of conversation around the sensory spaces, I actually thought that, I know Mr. Planberg, we spoke a little bit, or I shared maybe just as to where that might fit with the inclusive spaces. And maybe we can broaden the scope of what that is, and adding that as a kind of documented feature of the CIP might help us with the accountability moving forward, just to be able to kind of put out there in the scoping process that these are things that we've identified in the buildings, et cetera. This is areas of growth. Mr. Schuster, I don't know if that maybe resonates with some of what we discussed, or, yeah, go ahead.
No, it does resonate, and during this meeting, I've gotten correspondence that the members want to go ahead and follow that conversation with Dr. Boyd and myself. So, a part of this body, that work will continue, that conversation, and perhaps we could figure out a way through the board chair and vice chair, a way to communicate that back out so that that work is ongoing.
Yeah, it seems like an apt fourth column to that list of spaces in response to community questions. But those are my three. So I don't know, Mr. Smith, if you had thoughts on how to prioritize as we identify needs for the budget.
So I don't have any thoughts right now. I just know that prioritization is important for all of our work moving forward. And as we look at the scope of the board's work, the scope of the systems work from the superintendent's perspective, priorities are key. And I know that, as Dr. Brabrand presents his budget to the board, we'll have some more opportunities to think about what those major priorities should be.
Okay, I appreciate that. Ms. Cohen and whoever else wants to work on the sensory spaces piece, hopefully we can touch base to pick up on where that's been going. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple comments and then we'll close out. Mr. Plattenberg and your staff, I just do want to thank you for the incredible work you've done on the environmental areas. And with that, I'm hoping that maybe next time our go around in the CIP, we talked a little bit about this, maybe we reformat that environment section to really highlight the joint goals that we have with the county and our focus on those and the progress on those. I think, those are so important. And just along those lines, the solar information in the environment section is a bit out of date because of all the great current efforts that you have going on. So I do want to just mention quickly, I have the pleasure of having Kent Gardens as the most overcrowded elementary school. And I just mention it because one of the things that I have been in touch with our at-large members, but for everyone, one of the things we did this year is we've changed it's a French immersion school, and we changed the French immersion in boundary percentage to 75 versus 60% for the next school year to try to alleviate some of that. But it won't be enough. We need to keep an ongoing plan. And I say that only to, in closing, kind of highlight the incredible work that we have with ORSI. Ms. Root, I really appreciate your sort of big picture view of the data and information that you have and that you brought to us, and how your work needs to collaborate with facilities and our instructional side in order to really look at these areas holistically. And I know we've had, in preparation for the meeting, even conversations about how we're looking toward, as Ms. McLaughlin was pointing out, all these organizations to really work together strategically on these big questions and figure out how we move forward. So Dr. Brabrand, I appreciate too your next steps. I think that will help us with that. So I think we had a good, thorough discussion on a lot of topics here today and made some headway. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the information that you brought us and looking at how we'll move forward. So it is now 1:40. We do have yet to go today our discussion on the audit report. Ms. Tammy Dernak-Kofax is virtual today, so when we return, Bev and Laura will be taking the list of who's speaking and working with Tammy, who is virtual today, to keep that portion of the meeting running forward. So board members, just be prepared for that. And so we will take a half an hour break for lunch at this point, so we'll return to this room at 2:10. That makes sense? Thank you, everybody.